from the National Library. I won't read all of it. All I will do is just go through explaining what was happening pre-1600s with regards to slavery. Origins of slavery. Slavery in the Caribbean and the Americas was a relatively modern phenomenon. However, slavery and other forms of enforced or bonded labor were not unknown to the northern and western Europeans who colonized the Caribbean and the Americas. Muslims from the Barbary states, North African countries such as Algiers and Tunisia, frequently raided coastal villages and towns, especially in southern Britain, to enslave people. The Spanish and the Portuguese used African labourers on the plantations in the Mediterranean and Atlantic colonies. I think we definitely have to dodge the hijack there. France and Venice had galley slaves, prisoners forced to work upon the galleys. Convicts and other prisoners could be branded, sentenced to hard labour, enlisted into the navy and army, or transported. Many of the early settlers in the American colonies were people who had been transported or spirited away and were sold to local landowners. The Royal Navy, Army, and Merchant Navy obtained many of their recruits through imprisonment as in press gang, and crimping, procuring soldiers or sailors by trickery or coercion. Once enlisted, soldiers and sailors were subject to harsh disciplines under the various mutiny acts and were tried under military courts rather than civil courts. Orphans and other children on the poor rate could be apprenticed. And I will be doing a little bit about the apprenticeship in Jamaica, which didn't work very well apparently. In short, ordinary people in the 17th and 18th centuries were not free by our definitions of freedom, and most were not able to vote or had many rights. Slavery in the Caribbean. Early labourers in the Caribbean were white transportees and indentured servants, but with a high mortality rate, they were unreliable as a source of labour. Also, once their term of indentureship was over, they were free to buy or rent their own land, or to return to Britain or go to other colonies. The Spanish and Portuguese were familiar with using forms of bonded labour, and enslaved indigenous American Indians to work in their American mines and plantations. However, indigenous populations had a high death rate, especially from European diseases. African labourers who had been used in Mediterranean and Atlantic colonies were considered more suitable than European and indigenous labourers, as they used to work in tropical agricultural conditions, eating tropical foods, and were resistant to European diseases. Most importantly, there seemed to be an inexhaustible supply of new Africans and friendly African nations willing and able to seek out new sources. Okay, now I could actually say a couple of things about that, because what's the difference between the indigenous Americans living in a tropical climate, eating tropical food? How come they are not able to work in a climate that they were born in and their ancestors were born in? This is why you have to read these things with discernment. Many ethnic groups in Africa practiced different forms of enslavement. Slaves were taken as prisoners of war, as they were in Europe, as payment for debt or as a punishment for crime. Europeans exploited this by supplying weapons and money to encourage raids and local wars to obtain more slaves. However, chattel slavery, where slaves and their offspring were considered to be property, was a concept developed by Europeans. Alright, so Colonial slavery. Plantation slavery, as experienced in the Americas, was chattel slavery, where slaves and their offspring were owned for life, subject to the whims of their owner, and could be punished or sold for minor offences. Children and parents could be separated. Slaves were gifted to friends and family, for example as a dowry on marriage, and slaves were inherited. Any freedom a slave had was limited by the laws of the country and by their owner. For example, hired slaves or those at market or at church might need passes to show that they were not runaways. Many laws were passed to restrict the rights and liberties of slaves, but also to put paternalistic responsibility onto the state and owners, for example to limit the number of hours worked in a day, to provide medical care, to provide grounds to grow food, to allow slave markets, to prevent old and infirm slaves being freed and cast on to parish relief, and so on. Alright, now here we can see where even though they talk about African slavery, this log here has got absolutely nothing to do with Africa. So it's a list of slaves including colours on board an American merchant ship en route from Alexandria, Virginia, to Charleston, South Carolina, but driven off route by bad weather and docking at Bermuda. That's 1835. And sadly I can't see the names because that would be a good document to see for names. Ironically, many found even these few rights removed once they were freed. During the period of apprenticeship 1834 to 1838, former slaves, still working on plantations, found that medical care might be non-existent or that they had to pay for it. Waste ground for personal crops was put back into the plantation, and the former slaves could be forced to leave their homes if they did not work to expectations. Most freed people of relatively modest means in the Caribbean, including many free black people, owned slaves. Slaves were not necessarily cheap to buy, but once purchased, they and their offspring were owned for the rest of their lives. A carpenter, for instance, might have owned one slave to help in the workshop and keep house, but also to hire out. Similarly, many ship owners owned slaves to work on their boats and to hire out to other ship owners as labourers and crew. Thus, many slaves not only worked for their owner and their household, but could be further exploited as a source of income. Record of slaves. There are few, if any, records of slaves themselves. They could not own property, make contracts, and were not able to attend church, at least in the older British colonies. Most records relating to slaves are to be found in records relating to the owner. Even where slaves were baptized, they needed permission from their owner, and the records will state the name of the slave followed by the slave of or Negro of, and the name their owner. Free black people were also recorded as such: free black, free mulatto, and so on. Other records include official records of workhouses, court cases, inquiries into rebellions, and records of manumission, freedom. and newspaper adverts of runaway sales and notices for hiring of slaves. Colonial governments were also slave owners. Colonial authorities purchased and hired slaves as labourers and domestic servants in government properties. The British Army and Royal Navy also owned and hired slaves as general labourers, undertaking domestic, barrack and dockyard duties, and also as skilled labourers such as craftsmen and sailmakers. Military authorities also bought slaves for military duties. Most went into the corps of military labourers and the West India regiments. The army considered them to be subject to military law, despite them not actually enlisting. Once discharged, they would then become a subject to local slave law, which is something the army tried to prevent. In the 1807 Mutiny Act, all military slaves were freed, although they remained as if enlisted. Rules and regulations for granting pensions and allowances to discharged soldiers did not apply to those who had been purchased. Okay. So again, I think what we have is testimony here to the fact that slaves were not in fact a question of colour, so much a question of class.